On a cold morning on the water, I go out to sea with my son. Far offshore, a shove, a sentence. No one will believe you. I float on the surface of the waves, letting the sea hold the testimony for me. But the shore remembers receipts, coordinates, the wet cap. Can a father take revenge with silence and paperwork instead of anger? I stay to the very end when silence speaks. A cold, early morning, the kind of chill with the briny tang of mist mixed with sea wind slipping through the cracks of the kitchen window. Walter folded the coat, still carrying the smell of salt and machine oil, and gently set it beside the chipped enamel coffee thermos and the old dark fishing cap. The wooden tabletop kept a dark ring that had been there for years, the imprint of the thermos each morning. On the wall, the clock ran half a beat slow. The house was empty of voices, only the kettle breathing softly, and at times, the thin cries of seagulls from the river emptying into the bay. He pulled out a chair and opened the expense ledger, the pale brown of old paper reflected on his calloused fingers. Amid a calm maze of figures, there was a thin pencil line drawn across. From now on, no more the word rescue. The stroke wasn't deep, but it ran straight, decisive, like a thread stitching shut a small tear. He set the pen tip on the edge of the page not to write, only to remember the feeling of the pen fitting snug in his hand. Then he closed the ledger, his thumb running down the frayed spine. The sheet came to rest in its proper place, as if everything else still consented to remain where it belonged. He poured the coffee into a cup, the warmth striking his palm. He took a small sip, the familiar bitterness warming his throat. In the kitchen, dishwater left overnight still held a few white bubbles clinging to the basin's sides. A frayed dishcloth hung over the back of a chair. The old wooden cabinet had a door slightly sagged, a hinge long unused, squeaking when the wind touched it. The porch light, dark since last night, sometimes flickering, sometimes steady, was still off, as dawn wasn't yet bright enough to call for it. Through the misted pane he looked out at the front yard, the steps slick with a thin sheen, shoe prints still on the strip of cement from the afternoon before. The street in the neighborhood still slept. Only the opposite neighbor's mailbox stood slightly ajar. Walter washed his hands under the running tap, his palms darkened with tiny cracks from the salt. He dried them on the towel, then brushed the fishing cap, flipped the bill to check the seam. The smell of sun and old sweat rose, a truthful smell, asking no permission and needing no explanation. He checked the zipper of the canvas bag for tackle. A steady rasp, no snag. A tin box with a bent corner at the bottom held spare hooks, knocking softly. A coil of aged line, a bit stiff, still obeyed when he gave one end a tug. He stood quiet for a moment in the kitchen, listening to the house breathe. Everything was slow, the light outside the window gathering into a gray streak, smelling of damp wood and sea salt. The seagulls' calls drifting in, not lively, only like a pencil line lightly drawn along the edge of the morning's page. He set the cup down exactly on the dark ring, so snug he didn't need to look. By the habit in his fingers, he knew he still remembered the place of everything in this kitchen, the matchbox in the second drawer, the bottle of vegetable oil in the left corner, the coffee pot's lid nicked in a very small spot from a knock. Memory isn't noisy, it lives by repeating small gestures. In the closet, the old leather wallet lay quiet on the coat shelf. He didn't open it, no need. Only a brief pause of his gaze at the wallet's edge told him there was something inside that steadied his heart, a piece of paper yellowed at the edges and a smile that keeps the light of another time. He closed the closet door, then picked up the small notebook set beside the coffee thermos, hearing the cover brush lightly against the wood. Outside, the water was rising on its own schedule. He had learned to trust that schedule, those steady up and down tides, boundaries clean cut without proclamation. In the kitchen, the chair opposite sat empty. He looked at that spot the way he would a small mooring in his own home, of a place no longer waiting for anyone to come back to be called by its proper name. He took another sip of coffee, letting the heat make a full circuit through his chest and dissolve slowly. A quiet day's fishing, he thought without shaping the words with his mouth. Quiet here didn't mean the absence of sound. Quiet meant no hand reaching out to borrow a little more, no measuring gaze, no voice slipping past kinship to touch the wallet. Quiet was letting a thin boundary appear and stand there, pressing no one down and begging no one for the right to exist. He folded the coat neatly into a small ridge, set the cap on top like a rock to break the wind. The thermos turned so its mouth faced his good hand. These things would go with him to the pier, as they had for years. Only this morning, in the air there was a very small shift he himself could barely name, like when you catch a new gray hair in the mirror. Not surprising, not painful, but making a person stand half a centimeter straighter. The thin pencil line in the ledger was still warm with the scent of wood. That promise raised no voice and needed no witness. It lay quiet on the page, and little by little cleared a space in his chest. Walter slid the chair back to its exact place, the legs gliding over the tiles with just enough sound to know he was still here. He let his eyes make one last circuit of the kitchen, the sink clean, the towel hanging straight, the window half closed, then set his hand on the edge of the coat as if setting a latch on a small decision. Outside, the sky was still pallid, the cloud edges not yet opening into color. The new day stood on the threshold, saying nothing. He didn't either, only calm breathing in and out and a quiet intention. To go out with the early water, let a line down, listen to the float touch the surface, and look after his own boundary small but straight enough to keep from losing his way. He took the small oil can from the drawer near the sink, the metal can with a dull body, a screw cap loose to the touch, its spout curved like a bird's beak. The breath of old oil rose, a mild smell of machinery and winter days. The kitchen door had long given a dry squeak each time it opened. Over the years, that sound had become a thin, tired habit clinging to the morning. Walter tilted the can and let a drop fall right onto the hinge pin. The drop held, dark as a little eye, then slowly soaked in. He pushed the door with his hand and heard the scrape of metal on metal vanish, giving way to an opening smooth as breath. He wiped the spilled edge of oil with a scrap of rag cut from an old t-shirt, folded it in half, careful as stowing away a sentence not yet ready to be spoken. Out on the porch, the yellow bulb had just dried of mist. The plastic toggle switch had a hairline crack running lengthwise like a wood grain. He pulled the switch down and then up. The light came on, testing a single flicker as if considering hesitation, then held steady. A warm color, unhurried, not blinking on and off like last night. Walter stood watching his shadow spill across the wet steps, half a handspan longer than the man himself. The sea wind carried a salty taste across, light as a hand that has just stroked a pane of glass. He lifted onto his toes and touched the tip of his shoe to the edge of the step, testing one beat. The creak from the other day had softened since he oiled it last week. That tiny change no one noticed, but it took one complaint out of the house. He turned back into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and took down an old magnet, a flat plastic fish with the paint worn at the tail. The slip of paper with chores pinned under the magnet since last night read, "Change fishing line, life jacket, bring bandages." His handwriting was steady, the letters standing upright, not slanted. He used a fingernail to smooth the slightly curled edge, pressing the slip to lie straight, the upper right corner flush with the door's edge. Behind it were other slips already yellowed, the boat oil brand, the bait shop's hours, and a coupon already expired. He pulled an old slip out, folded it neatly, and dropped it into the drawer. Everything was less cramped, breathing easier. The chipped enamel coffee thermos still gave off an even warmth. He opened his wallet, the dark brown leather gone soft with years. The stitching at the left corner frayed, lifting like a grass bank. Inside, his wife's photo lay under a thin plastic sleeve, the edge lightly scuffed like foam licking the shore. Old sunlight still clung to her smiling eyes, a kind of light not from the sky, but from days that no longer come back. He didn't take the photo out. He only set the tip of his finger on the plastic edge and held it there a few seconds, as if touching something that cannot be put into words. From the leather came a warm scent spreading out, the smell of a person and sea salt and the days of simple living together. He closed the wallet, not sighing, not holding anything in, just closed it like shutting a door he would open again, but not now. He rummaged in the drawer for adhesive bandages and checked the glue. The strip still stuck, not old yet. He set the small first aid kit back near the door, where a hand could reach it even in the dark. On the table, a new spool of fishing line still hugged tight in plastic. He stretched a full arm's length, hearing the nylon slide over dry skin with a light sting. The old line he folded in two, wound it up, and slipped it into his pocket to trade at the bait shop for a few small coins. He hung the life jacket at the peg near the door. The smell of waterproof fabric rubbed against the house's smell and made a third scent. Not the sea, not wood, but like an unspoken reminder. He walked one circuit of the kitchen, each small step with its task. He pushed the chair back so it fit the exact divot in the tile. He picked up a crumb of bread and dropped it into the trash. He set the broom straight from its tilted lean. These very light corrections were like adjusting a jacket to sit right on one's shoulders. That neatness gave the morning clear borders, what belongs to now, what belongs to the moment of stepping out the door, what can be left for evening. He lifted his eyes to the porch light again through the pane. The light did not change, lying still like a hand set on the shoulder of someone newly calmed. For a moment, Walter saw the very small distance between flickering and holding steady. That distance, on other days insignificant, today felt like a graphite boundary being drawn on a sheet of paper. Not noisy, not showy, but durable if no one tries to erase it. He curled his hand into the coat and gave it a shake, the fabric rustling softly like rain on an old tin roof. His salt-toughened fingers slid into the sleeve, finding the familiar seam. The fishing cap was set exactly on the coat, and the thermos turned so its handle faced his right hand, a small movement enough to save a second when needed. He tightened the lid until it clicked, the sound of things being in their proper place. Before leaving, he stood on the threshold. The house behind him breathed lightly, like a creature he had soothed back to itself. Hinges quiet, porch light steady. The slip under the magnet did not tremble. Wallet closed. Those quiet signs lined up, declaring nothing but readiness. He laid his palm on the door's wood, feeling the cold thread through his skin. In that moment, he recognized the quiet he'd been after. Quiet not as the absence of sound, but the absence of unreasonable demands. He brushed his hand against the jacket pocket where the wallet lay, as if signing his name to a small resolve. Then he drew the door. The latch tongue slid into the strike with a light, decisive click. No squeal, no harsh snap, only a small click, like a nod between two people who understand each other. He closed the door very gently, letting the porch light pour through the edge of the small window pane and paint a thin strip of gold across the steps. His hand left the handle without hurry. On his shoulder, the coat lay neatly. Under his arm, the thermos kept its heat, and in his chest, a fine boundary had just been drawn. No one could see it, but it was enough for him to step down the stairs without slipping out of himself. The harbor town opens its eyes earlier than anywhere else. The road along the seawall is still wet with dew. Old tire tracks glitter with salt. The smell of damp rope and wet wood slips into the lungs like a tonic that opens the chest. Sections of tin roofing on the fish warehouses tick as the wind slaps across them, ragged flags shivering lightly on their poles. A thin film of fog hangs over the water, making the mooring buoys look like drifting stones. The seagulls call here and there, unhurried, like punctuation marks placed just right for a story that needs no narrator. Walter pulled the Gior into a lot strewn with crushed shells. He cut the engine and listened to the block cool, like someone exhaling after a long day. With the coffee thermos snug in his elbow and the tackle bag tucked under his arm, he stepped out. Wind from the mouth of the bay carried the metallic smell of anchors, the scent of algae and machine grease, and he tugged his collar one notch higher. Ahead stood a row of low buildings, the bait shop glowing early, fluorescent tubes buzzing steadily. Beside it, the harbor office with its fogged glass door and a sign, Weather, Channel WX2. The bait shop's door chime gave a thin ring as he pushed in. On the counter, boxes of lures, frozen shrimp, and bloodworms lay in plastic trays, cold water beating into drops along the rims. The raw, briny smell mixed with the strong coffee scent from a cheap steel thermos on the back shelf, making the morning feel half awake, half dazed. In the corner, a small radio was set to the Weather Channel, a man's voice slowly reading a warning for moderate seas, winds shifting after 10. Regular beeps cut in like a bird tapping a piling. Walter bought a small packet of lead shot, a spool of sinking line, and a few spare hooks. The items clicked against one another in the plastic bag, a dry, familiar sound. The phone in his jacket vibrated once. The screen lit a silvery blue. Cole. Go farther out for space. No greeting, no exclamation point, just 5 words like an arrow pointing the way. He looked at the message for a second, slid a finger to darken the screen, then pocketed it again. The tide was coming in. The smell of the water had changed. He felt his back straighten a touch. A reflex before an unquestionable line of text. Out on the dock, orange life jackets were stacked neatly on a metal rack, lines coiled tight, the plastic hooks all facing the same way. On the wall, a whiteboard said, in careful lettering, "Rental boats return key before 5 p.m." Underfoot, the damp boards left dark trails where people had passed. The round-headed screws showed specks of rust around their edges. Walter set the bag down and tugged a mooring line strung on a diagonal. It answered with solid give, no jerks. At the dock's end, the office loudspeaker repeated the forecast. Low morning clouds, fog thinning, recommended to wear flotation when going beyond buoy number 6. The voice didn't press, only reminded. He stepped onto the plank walkway leading to the pontoon, his measured stride giving the wood time to settle under the weight of each footfall. Each board quivered and then rested again, like a heartbeat past its hurry. The water below looked darker under the cluster of berthed boats. Where 2 hulls met, the rubber fenders squeaked, audible but not grating. A salt and pepper cat slipped out from behind a bin of nets, moving with the casual air of a dock owner, sniffed at his bag, then padded off. Its tail curled like a question mark not yet needing an answer. Cole appeared by the rental boat, walking fast, a light jacket zipped to the throat. He slid past, tipped his head in a nod, and didn't linger long enough for the cologne and salt to settle in the air together. His hand skimmed the gunnel as if checking, though he knew he'd already checked. No greeting, the nod was enough. Walter answered by placing the tackle bag in the exact spot beside the helm, slow and precise, like replying with a complete sentence without speaking it aloud. On deck, a larger radio fixed to the console was already on the Weather Channel. The little needle of the wind gauge trembled and then held. The dock's communal life jacket lay in a plastic bin, its name tag looped on with a black zip tie. Beside it, the first aid box sat with a fresh crimped seal, the stamped mark still sharp. Walter looked over everything the way one reviews a passage long memorized, not out of doubt, but to assure himself each detail sat where it should. He set the coffee thermos down on the wooden step, handle turned toward his right hand. A seagull settled on a piling a few meters away, feathers stuck into clumps with wet, small yellow eyes, watching without judgment. Back at the shore, the bait shop door had swung half closed, its glass reflecting the water in a blur like spilled ink. A man in a knit cap trundled a wheelbarrow of ice behind him, the wheel grinding over gravel with a rushing rasp. At the dock's end, a crab boat slid by, the deckhand a small dot moving in the mist. The town woke by degrees, but no one was noisy. Each person did a small task, meshing like gear teeth without slipping. Walter tested his breathing, matching it to the little ruffles on the surface. He heard the sea's house sounds, the kind of noise that doesn't want to be heard and yet persists. A mooring line snapping a soft kick now and then, a signboard creaking, the radio reading another round of forecasts. Everything was just enough. Life jackets stacked, the Weather Channel set, the text sent and seen, the nod exchanged. The rest was his footsteps on the planks, slow and sure, moving toward the water's edge, where a person need only know how to keep balance before letting himself into a long morning. The engine purred like a throat that had just rasped and then soothed. The hull gave a very slight tremor, The water beneath the deck changed its voice, sliding evenly along both sides like a hand stroking. The dock lines were loosed. The eye of the anchor line slipped off the wooden cleat with a short tick. The key receded, mixing cement with moss into a long brown streak that clung lightly at the corner of the eye and then blurred. The warehouse tin roof shrank behind them. The bait shop sign shrank like a postage stamp at the end of an envelope. The salt and pepper cat that had been running along the plank's edge stopped at the dock's end, tucked its tail, and watched the boat draw away as if watching a habit set just out of reach. Cole bent over the console, his fingers gliding across the row of switches like playing an overture he knew by heart. He cut the radio off mid-sentence as it read the weather. The male voice vanished, leaving only short, breathless beeps. "So it's not noisy." His gaze skimmed the deck in a quick sweep, movements neat and closed. Without waiting, his other hand reached for the phone in Walter's jacket pocket. A touch light enough not to drop it, quick enough not to invite dialogue. "Keep it from getting wet." The offhand caption fell somewhere between the wind and the engine, and the phone was stuffed into the compartment in front of the helm, where it smelled of new plastic and old salt. The compartment lid shut with a click, as simple as stowing a mindless object. The screen went dark, Walter's own shadow flashing for a moment on the black glass. Walter crouched, his knees touching the deck with a dry clack. He tightened the cleat hitch one he had tied 1,000 times, checking the turns around the bit to make sure the strand ran the right way, not crossing the edge so it would squeal when needed. His calloused palm slid along the damp rope, the scrape of the fibers against skin recalling other mornings. Trips out, returns home. He gave a light tug. The line answered with familiar spring, no jerk, no mush in the core. At the bow, a rubber bumper tapped very softly against the side, then stilled. The small things lined up, line cleat anchor pin compartment lid switches, each like a letter taking its place in a sentence. The early wind from the bay's mouth slid along his collar, the cold smell of water seeping into his coat and touching the breastbone. He pulled the zipper up one more notch, the teeth catching with a very fine tick, a small but rounded confirmation. The fabric edges closed snug, blocking the straight shot of wind. The collar rose just enough to cover the pulse line. He pulled the cap lower. The brim cut his sight line so the water ahead narrowed into focus. His chin brushed the fabric washed with cheap soap, that smell mixing with salt and machine oil, a blend only early mornings at the harbor can make. The boat cut through the water, leaving behind 2 white wakes opening out like a pair of parentheses, cradling a sentence just written. Marker number 4 fell away to port. The wind bell atop it rang once and went still, like an old person giving a single cough to clear the throat. Farther on, a cormorant cupped its own reflection in the surface, its glossy black neck lifting like the needle of another kind of clock, one that measures not time, but the direction of calm. Overhead, low clouds stretched into bands, the light torn into thin slices, falling on the bay here silver, their lead, their moldy green. The boat slid through those patches of color like moving through rooms in an old house. Cole kept his hand on the throttle, eyes forward, shoulders not touching the seat. The cologne mixed with salt into a brief note, fleeting and carried off by the wind. He leaned to check the GPS mounted on the panel, the blue backlight casting a cold halo on the ripples at his shoe tips. Each of Cole's movements was like punctuation placed exactly, final, sparse, not repeated. Walter stood behind, leaving a step and a half between himself and the helm, a distance just far enough not to intrude, just close enough that, if needed, his hand could reach something in time. He glanced at the first aid box beside the mate's seat, the pull tab still lead-sealed, the lid tight. Together they made a kind of industrial reassurance, the reassurance for someone who knows how to trust procedure. The water changed its tone as the boat left the harbor's cover. The shore was now only a very thin brown line behind them, like a thread marking a page already closed. The low houses became gray blocks stuck together. Power lines striped the sky like a graphite stroke. Walter balanced to the boat's rhythm, knees slightly open, feet set at an angle, joints loose to absorb the motion. He checked the tin bait box in the corner, clamped the lid tight, nudged it snug against the coaming. Spare hooks in the canvas pouch clicked together like old coins in a child's pocket. Along the side deck, the lifebuoy's lanyard was neatly knotted, the tag end tucked in so it wouldn't catch. The set of the wind shifted a little. The surface took on a darker voice. The smell of weed began to stand out. Between them, there weren't many words. Silence structured the space by itself. The steady engine, the water exhaling light, the wind sliding past the antenna mast into thin ribbons. The radio being off made the span wider still, like when someone pulls every parenthesis from a paragraph and lets the sentence run on. Walter's eyes flicked for a beat toward the compartment where his phone lay, then back to checking the fittings of the rod rig. No long thoughts. Just putting everything into the order he knew. The numbered buoys marking the bay's outlet dropped back one by one. Buoy number 6, the one the dockman had advised wearing flotation beyond, slipped past to starboard, a ring of red paint half peeled to show the gray metal beneath. The boat took a bit more throttle. The bow leaned into the morning ripples, the hull vibrating like an animal settling into its steady run. Walter set his hand on the rail, feeling the metal cold seep through his skin. On the backs of his hands, sun blotches lay thick with color, burning under the meager morning light. He noticed a pale thread stuck to his cuff, plucked it free, rolled it into a ball, and slipped it into his coat pocket, a reflex to keep the deck clean, to keep memory from clinging to scraps. Ahead, a patch of water flashed brighter, like a tilted pane catching the sky. The deck had fewer stray things now, fewer human sounds, leaving only the actions. In his chest, Walter's breathing found its pace, moving with the engine. He watched the channel widen and felt his inner edge widen a little too, not for any promise, but for a quiet made of a smooth engine, tightened lines, the early wind passing his collar, and a zipper that closed just right. The road of a long day began like that, the shore a brown streak, the radio gone mute, a phone lying still in a closed compartment, and the lines checked one last time before everything on the water became true to its nature, even, cold, straight, and owing no one an explanation. The water changed color from moldy green to a dense, saturated dark, not from the sky, but as if the bay's own belly had clenched. The hull was lifted by the ridges of swell and set down again, each beat unhurried, yet enough that Walter's right knee unconsciously opened a few more degrees, and his foot sought a deeper hold. The engine shifted key, lower and thicker. The water striking the hull sounded like someone pushing a heavy door, with a shoulder-steady, cold, neither friendly nor hostile. Behind them, the shoreline was only a thin brown line, bent along the spine of the waves like a thread marking a page already turned and not coming back. The life jacket still lay under the bench, its orange dimmed in the deck's shadow. The pull tabs showed a clean white tip, dry. Its plastic face hadn't taken a single drop of water, like a gaze never once called upon. Walter bent a little, only to be sure it was still there. He noticed Cole's foot had nudged it deeper while he shifted his weight. A movement not strong enough to count as intent, not careless enough to go unregistered. At the bow, the anchor had been brought up at some point, the iron hook nested on the bow roller, the shank flecked with dry salt, the chain white as chalk from blown foam. No road paid out into the water to anchor the feeling of stopping, only the engine assuring the water they were still underway. The channel markers changed their beat. No. 6 had fallen behind, number 8 off to port, its red paint bitten away in a patch to show the gray metal beneath. Walter looked out across the surface and saw a darker band of current cutting across their course, the boundary between two bodies of water tugging along two contrary thoughts. The surface was no longer the speckled mirror silver of the near shore. The swells were longer, farther apart, each one carrying the drag of things that don't care whether anyone is there or not. A solitary cormorant surfaced in the emptiness, shook itself, drew a fine line of water and vanished, leaving a space that hadn't yet closed. Walter set his hand on the rail. Near a bolt, a smear of dried salt spread like the print of a small hand from some day 5 fingers traced by a few thin cracks. He remembered the first time he took his boy out on calm water, the tiny hand gripping the oar handle, the thumb rubbing his wrist bone to find a steady point, the smell of cheap sunscreen mixed with the damp wood of the oar, the boy counting waves at random and laughing when he counted wrong. He didn't keep those images as a defense of the present only, as a piece of sky that slipped inside him and cannot be taken away. Now that same hand grown, its own scent hidden under cologne, stood at the helm, shoulders straight, eyes not glancing back, as if reading a score where the rest were no longer allowed to be held. The early wind changed its voice, slid down his collar, carrying a thicker smell of weed. Walter pulled the zipper one more notch, the teeth pinging lightly against his skin. He glanced at the lead-sealed first aid kit, the crimped stamp still intact, like a small door that has never been opened. Under the seat, the tin bait box gave a soft tap each time the boat changed rhythm, reminding him that small things were still there, ready, more faithful than intention. On the console, the radio was off. Its indicator light still cast a quiet point of green, like the unblinking eye of someone who has chosen to step out of the conversation. The boat slanted across the edge of another water, distinctly darker, like a spill of ink poured from the bottom. Walter adjusted his center of gravity by instinct, lowered his shoulders, loosened his elbows, letting his body absorb the shake. He heard clearly the foreline snap a soft tack now and then, and each time a small nerve inside him snapped with it and then lay still. He checked the life jacket's position once more without bending down, only locating it the way one locates an exit in a theater before the film begins. Everything lived in those details. A life jacket not worn, an anchor already up, a radio already shut down, a phone lying still in a closed compartment. None of them shouted, but each, set in its proper place, together drew a vector. A crabber crossed in the distance, no more than a dark block with an antenna pricked with a few points of silver. Its engine note didn't reach them. The water between the two boats traded nothing but ripples where wake met wake. Overhead, the cloud edges brightened one notch, while the water darkened one notch, two ruled lines heading opposite ways. Walter rubbed his fingertip lightly over the salt smear on the rail. The salt crumbled under his touch like chalk dust. He shook his hand and the grains fell away without a sound. The distance between him and the helm stayed the same. A step and a half, neither closer nor farther. That distance was a stance, an awareness of where he stood. He opened the coffee thermos lid and took a very small sip to warm his chest. The heat made one circuit and dissolved into the engine's sound. Everything now lay within his small circle of control: the hitch, the line, the thermos's place, the zipper, his breath. The heading, though, was in someone else's hands. He didn't recount the buoys, didn't ask how the tide ran. He only listened and took note. The water deepened, the swells lifted and set the hull. The life jacket still lay under the bench. The anchor had already been raised. Walter looked at the dry salt smear on the rail and remembered the small hand once gripping the oar. No one said what needed saying. He bent to set out the bait, his fingernail popping the tin lid with a small click. The fishy smell of just thawed shrimp mixed with metal. Right then, the boat shifted its balance, not because of the waves. A neat shove from behind. No warning. Not heavy enough to be brutal, but just enough to strip away familiar balance. The edge of the deck scraped across his side, cold metal cutting quickly through the coat's fabric. Everything in his sight flipped over like a page yanked away. The water grabbed him. The cold locked his chest, an invisible clamp, tightening with no negotiation. His mouth opened by reflex. A briny bitterness rushed in. His ears went muffled. The world was only the heavy sound of water closing around his head. He kicked once on instinct, heavy as kicking into darkness. His knees met the deeper water. His coat sucked in water and ballooned like a creature clinging to his shoulders. Up on the rail, Cole's voice fell, thin as foam. "Nobody will believe you." Not high, not ringing, light as a scrap of paper let go. Then the engine changed pitch, pulling the thread of sound farther away. The hull drew back, leaving a white seam of wake splitting the surface. The plastic locker before the helm was shut. Inside it, a black, dead screen. The radio had already gone quiet. The life jacket still lay somewhere under the bench out of reach. He broke the surface, didn't call out. His throat burned with salt, as if someone had just rinsed it with fire. Air made it only halfway in, jammed in his chest. His rib cage shook with the effort to hold back a cough. He groped, fingertips scraping a hull already too far, only fine foam breaking under his touch. His other hand swept the cap from his eyes. The cap slipped away at once, spun a few times, then billowed on the waves like a fish short of breath. He watched it for a blink. The dark fabric was the only marker on a surface growing darker. The coat pulled him down. Water threaded into the layers of cloth, adding weight ounce by ounce each second. He checked the panic with motions learned in winters past. Tilt the head, find air, gather strength into the fingers. He tugged the zipper down, the teeth numb with cold, but at last they slid. One shoulder slipped from its sleeve first, then the other, each centimeter peeling from the heavy fabric. The coat sloughed off, looped once around his hips as if to hold him back, then let go, sinking, turning into a dark patch, dropping away, letting up a few small bubbles to the surface. He rolled onto his back. The sun was still low, light slicing through clouds into thin blades, but enough to tell sky from water. He spread his arms, hands open like two leaves, to make the body lie flat. His back rasped against the cold, but his lungs found a rhythm at the upper edge of panic. Breathe in, slow, breathe out, slow. The words were unsounded, only the smallest movements of the diaphragm. He counted the beats to a low-flying goal as it passed. 1, the wing drops. 2, the wing lifts. 3, hold. 4, take a touch more air. 5, don't kick too hard or you'll flip. 6, set your head into the floating track. The pounding in his ears eased, turning into a thick, even undertone. The water around him spread so wide it erased the very idea of boundaries. The shore was now a faint graphite stroke, far away, lying level like a sentence not yet finished. The sound of Cole's engine thinned to a fine thread, then was worn away by wind. Only the small sounds of little waves feeding into each other and his own breath, which sometimes sounded like it belonged to someone else. On his wrist, at the jut of bone, a raw line burned. When he was shoved, his wrist had scraped the hull's bolt. That small pain shone sharp in the cold, a red warning light against a gray field. He sculled his hands very lightly, just enough to keep his heading. Each time he lifted his neck, the water tried to pour in. He lowered the nape, let his ears sink, eyes fixed on the sky. The clouds pulled into bands, thin white, with a silver-blue strip between. He chose a cloud shaped roughly like a leaf as his point. Every 10 counts he checked whether it still sat at the same edge of his vision. If it drifted too far right, his body was turning. If it slid downward, his legs were dropping. Lessons no one teaches, save the water itself, reviewed in a few minutes longer than winter. Somewhere the cap still bobbed, turning a circle, face up to the sky like a clumsy eye. He heard a bird's sharp cry, the sound falling to the surface and splintering into thin pieces. His calves began to tremble, not from fear, but because the muscles remembered hours of work in the cold. He didn't fight the water. He borrowed it to keep himself afloat, loosening where loosening was needed, tensing only the least where tension was needed. Thoughts tried to find a way in, but he blocked them at the threshold the way you block wind at a door. No questions, no naming, no conjecture. Only numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Another goal skimmed past, white like a strip torn from a matchbook. He counted with it, and each time he reached 10, he let out a breath a little longer than before. The water was cold, but not cruel. It only did what water does, kept its secrets and demanded respect for its rules. Cole had gone far. The radio mute, the phone in a closed locker, the life jacket under the bench. It was only him and the Count and a patch of sky changing color very slowly. He lay on his back, breathing slow, counting to the beat of the gull's wings, circle after circle, like a man keeping himself from falling into a thought that could kill him before the water ever got the chance. Ivy May emerged as a dark mass wrapping the silver of morning, her bow sweeping the mist into a thin ribbon. The smell of diesel mixed with weed and wet nets rode the wind. On the cramped deck, crab pots stood in rows, ropes coiled like sleeping nests of snakes. The boat slid across the patch of water where Walter's fishing cap bobbed, a dark speck of cloth on darker water. The deckhand girl, a kid just past a summer of growing, hair tucked under a knit cap, an elastic looped at her wrist, was the first to see that speck slipping off the rhythm of the waves. She leaned over the rail, her gaze drawing a straight line to the face-up figure on the water. No need to say a word. The ring buoy sprang from its bracket like a practiced habit. Left hand yanked the pin, right hand threw. The buoy traced half a sun in the air and fell, cutting the surface with a solid thump. The line came taut, a white rope crossing the gap, stopping at the weight and lightness of a life. Walter rolled a shoulder and reached for the buoy, his numb fingers locking onto the plastic rim. The cold at his back eased a little. From the deck, the rope paid in steady, without jerks. A calloused hand on the line hers first, then replaced by a larger one, with green veins raised under the skin, drew him in toward the boat. Each time a swell lifted, the rope slackened for a beat and then tightened. Each time the boat dropped, his body came a handspan closer. The crab pots jostled under the puller's feet, the nets catching one another with a dry rustle like leaves. The rail came alongside. A boat hook slid down, its tip biting the buoy's rim, holding it where the waves couldn't spin it. A calloused hand gripped Walter's wrist. The warmth of living skin passed into the fluttering pulse in him, a heat with no smell of salt. One heave, and half of him was up. Another, his knees scraped the wooden edge. Then his whole body slid onto the deck, water streaking along the grooves. The hull cut some of the wind. The deck was rough, flat, and real. An old wool scarf cheap soap smell, a few threads sprung, was thrown around his shoulders, catching the shiver running the length of his shoulder blades. His breath came back as a human sound, no longer the shattered hiss of water. The girl knelt beside him and pressed the scarf to his nape with the tact of someone who has seen this cold many times. No questions, no consoling words, only straight gestures. The skipper broad-shouldered, oilskin-bleached pale with salt popped the lid of the plastic box that held the log. He pulled the pencil cord from his wrist, clicked the lead, and wrote a clear line on the damp page. Hour, minute, second. He glanced at the GPS. Numbers jumped and then held, the coordinates stopping like two pins pressed into an invisible chart. The pencil added latitude, longitude, wind direction, wave height by eye. The alphabet of the sea recorded without wasting words. The VHF crackled to life. The skipper's thumb pressed the transmit key, held just enough. His voice, coming out through the speaker, was flat and dry as a printed sheet. Vessel name, position, condition, person in water recovered. Request to notify the harbor master. Not a word extra. On the return channel, a brief acknowledgement. The antenna's metal frame hummed lightly. A few invisible waves had just linked the small boat to shore and to other logs. Walter lay on his side, feeling the deck under his cheekbone. The smell of wet wood and old oil rose close to his skin, strong and honest. The wool scarf slowed the drip from his hair. Outside, Ivy May kept moving, not fast, not in sharp turns, the bow changing heading to bring the patch of newly recovered body into calmer water. A plastic medical box sat ajar, chemical heat packs, disposable gloves, adhesive bandages. A calloused hand slid a snapped heat pack under the scarf at the base of his skull. Warmth crept slowly into his neck. The deckhand lifted the fishing cap she had just scooped from the water, inverted it over a crab pot to drain, then set it beside him, close enough to see with a turn of the head. A small gesture, but like an answer. Someone had seen and chosen to pick that thing up from the surface. At the helm, the skipper kept writing. Hat recovered. Jacket no. Conscious yes. Short words in a row, as clear as channel markers. The VHF sounded again. A channel changed, another voice replied. The word harbor master rang out, hard as an anchor. The skipper read out the coordinates once more, pointed toward the nearest safe approach to shore, then hung the mic back on its clip. He checked Walter's eyes with the back of his hand. No pressure, a small nod like the period at the end of a complete sentence. The wind still blew beyond the rail, but inside the circle of wool, Walter could make out a different music. Footsteps shifting on deck, pencil rasping on paper, the VHF cord easing a notch as the mic was rehung. Those sounds gathered into a reality with sharp edges, with names, with witnesses. The water outside the boat was as cold as ever. Within, it warmed by precise actions. He sighed not from fatigue, but because his lungs had finally remembered how to open fully. The shore was still far, but no longer nameless. A line of ink had been laid down. Time, coordinates, condition, and with it a person had been seen. The harbor office was like a warmly lit box amid a still wet morning. Glass door fogged with breath, a tide calendar pasted in the lower corner, and beside it a bulletin board pinned with thumbtacks. Storm hours, emergency numbers, a list of rental boats that returned keys yesterday. The smell of kerosene from the heater mixed with printer paper and old salt. On the counter sat a plastic tray of pencils tied on strings, a worn red ink stamp, and a book-sized thermal printer perched on a stack of invoices. Beyond the doorway frame came the scrape of a forklift dragging a pallet of ice, the hoist line whispering like a throat warming up. Walter sat on a vinyl chair crazed with fine cracks, his back just far enough from the oil heater. Heat seeped through the damp wool sweater, not burning, only soaking in, loosening the tight places in his chest. The wet fishing cap lay on the armrest, dripping to the floor in a dark streak. The wool scarf someone had just draped over his shoulders had lightened. Its corner steamed faintly. On the small table by the wall, a porcelain dish held a few peppermint candies. The scents of candy, kerosene, and fresh print combined into a homely, decisive warmth, free of frills. Harriet stood behind the counter. Short silver hair, thin-rimmed glasses, held by a brown fabric cord looped behind her neck. Long fingers, nails cut close, edges whitened by salt. She drew the tray of receipts closer and flicked the button on the thermal printer. The machine purred, the white roll feeding out thin, glossy, still warm. The morning's fuel receipt for the rental boat. Pump time, liters, boat ID, name of the signer. She tore off a length, pressed the edge flat, and set it to the left. Beneath the counter lay a thick, blue-covered harbor log, the page corners worn white. She'd opened to today's page. Neat block capitals in steady lines. Departure time, boat number, heading out, life jacket notes. She traced back a few entries, stopped at the morning rental, drew a ballpoint, and darkened the hour and minute with just enough ink. To the right, she added a small label, copy. She pressed the date stamp into the lower corner, the red circle coming out clean and full. Channel 16 was kept in a separate thin pad. Each call a line, calling vessel, brief contents, valuable as pins on the invisible chart of the morning. Harriet glanced at the wall clock to match Ivy May's recovery time. The minute hand licked past the 7. She dotted the pin and carefully copied the line already relayed, sliding a sheet of thin carbon beneath. When she finished, there were 2 copies, one for the harbor file, one to hand to the man warming himself by the oil heater. No speculation, no added words. Walter held both hands toward the heater, knuckles cracked by salt flushing pink in the firelight. The heat steadied his breathing. The printer stopped, its tiny blade snapped with a tack. Harriet gathered 3 sheets, the morning's fuel receipt, the copied harbor log line with the rental boat's departure time, and the Channel 16 call record noting person recovered. Each sheet brought out a number, hour, minute, coordinates like small nails pinning the day to its place. She touched a ballpoint dot to the corner, certified copy. Then she pulled a clear plastic sleeve from the drawer, the kind with a sliding rail, still smelling of new plastic. Before handing it over, she blotted the invoice edges with a tissue so the ink wouldn't smear, blew lightly. A careful motion, like setting a cup down exactly inside the old ring on a tabletop. She didn't hold Walter's eyes too long. Her gaze rested more on the papers, as if kindness also needed distance to keep from turning into pity. She laid the sheets in order from left to right. Harbor log fuel receipt, Channel 16 record. The truth, if it must go with someone, ought to travel in this formation. Walter took the sleeve. The thin plastic kept the warmth of her hand for a moment, then cooled. He set it on his knee and slid the rail off. The plastic edge made a very soft shur, a reminder that some things need only the right groove to be at peace. He wiped his fingers on the scarf so he wouldn't spot the paper with water. The first sheet went in, lower edge against the sleeve's base, and he smoothed it straight. The second laid perfectly over the timeline of the first, like an answer standing right behind its question. The third, bearing the coordinates, sat on top, the red stamp in its corner hooking into the blue stamp of the sheet beneath. 3 layers of paper became a single plane, quiet and weighted. The oil heater crackled. A tiny spark leapt out and died in the air. Outside, a gull skimmed the tin roof, leaving a faint ribbon of sound. Ivy May had pushed off again, leaving the smell of wet nets and the sound of water shaken from the pots. The harbor office kept its own tempo, clock hand moving, paper drying, ink soaking, plastic sliding. Walter closed the sleeve rail, drawing the single strip until he heard it seat. The sleeve fit his hand just right, neither heavy nor light, but clearer than anything he'd had before stepping aboard at dawn. Harriet took the stamp once more and pressed it onto a tiny delivery slip marked "Copy Issued." She clipped it to the sleeve's edge. The gesture came without words, like setting a pebble on freshly filled ground to hold it against the wind. On the desk, she drew one last line in the log, handed to signature. Her handwriting did not tremble. Walter set the sleeve on his thigh and laid his palm over the plastic. Through the clear layer, the rows of numbers lay orderly, asking no one's attention yet, ready to go farther than a voice. The water outside was still cold, the shore still far, hearts not yet truly settled. But here, in a room smelling of kerosene and fresh print, a part of the day had been put in its proper place, time where time belongs, coordinates where coordinates belong, a signature where a signature belongs. The wet cap still sat on the armrest, each drop hitting the floor distinctly. He sat still, letting the warmth travel another stretch in his chest, then tucked the sleeve into his coat pocket. No judgment, only the careful filing of papers into a clear plastic cover enough that later, if needed, they could speak for themselves. Evening fell with a salt-tinged light, settling through the kitchen window into a thin gray band on the wooden tabletop. Walter hung his wind-dried coat on the hook near the heater and turned his left wrist up under the lamp. Beneath the fine down of the skin, a bruise ripened to plum, stretching from the scaphoid to the rim of the wrist, a quiet purple ink mark. He set the phone against the rim of a cup and opened the camera. Close-up mode, the porch light slipped through the corner of the curtain, enough to show the blue vein running through the deep violet. He took one straight shot, one angled, another with the wall clock in the background, the minute hand at 5:42, and then one beside the hanging calendar, the date as clear as a stamp. He pulled out a chair and took from the lower drawer a thin black ring binder, the 3-ring kind, its outer edge worn to a silvery streak. When the cover opened, the smell of old binder and fresh print mingled into the scent of order. In the inner pocket, the clear plastic sleeve Harriet had given him that morning lay still, 3 flat sheets, the inked stamps not yet faded. Walter slid off the plastic rail and drew each sheet out as if lifting a fish from a net. The copy of the harbor log with the departure time, the morning fuel receipt for the rental boat, the Channel 16 entry reporting person recovered. He laid them on the table in a horizontal row, their lower edges flush with the table's edge, as if aligning his breath. From a small drawer, he took a 2-hole punch, the iron heel polished where his thumb had most often touched. He tested the harbor log sheet, aligning it to the A4 mark, pressed. 2 paper circles fell into the chip tray, a light tic-tac like rain tapping a tin roof. He punched the receipt, then the Channel 16 entry. Each sheet was turned the right way, the red stamped corner placed to the outside, so he wouldn't have to flip as much when looking things up. His right hand ran through 1,000 familiar motions. Feed the sheet onto the rings, press them ajar, thread through, let go, click, a snug sound. The thin binder thickened by a finger's breadth, just enough to notice when his hand rested on the spine. He printed the bruise photos on a pocket photo printer, the small sheets with adhesive backing. The picture came out slowly, the white base giving way to the plum dark, the edge already printed with the shot time. Walter peeled the backing and stuck the photo to a lined white sheet. In the upper right corner, he penciled, "Left wrist scrape on hull date time." The letters were even with very little slant. Below, he added a fine line, "Photo with clock 5:42 p.m." That sheet, too, was punched, threaded into the binder, set right after the harbor papers. A narrative line of evidence, place-time signal mark on skin. On his phone, he opened the screenshot of the message, "Go farther out for space." He didn't send it anywhere, only printed a black and white copy, the sender's name and receipt time visible in the corner. This sheet was thinner, plain printer paper, but he still punched it and filed it in the appendix. No further notes. The words had said as much as words can say. From a low cupboard, he pulled an old plastic box of multicolored tabs. He chose 3, blue on the edge of harbor log, red for channel 16, yellow for bruise. On each he wrote a capital letter, BKV. The tiny colored edges stuck out in an even row, like channel markers on a miniature fairway. On the front page, he clipped a contents list he had sketched quickly in pencil. 1. Harbor log time. 2. Fuel rental boat. 3. VHF call channel 16. 4. Bruise photo. 5. SMS go farther out for space. He spread the small nautical chart kept in the drawer and, with a fine pen, circled the coordinates Ivy May had reported in the morning, dotted a point on shore where the harbor office stood, drew a thin line linking the two, and wrote Ivy May recovery coordinates time. The warmth of his hand warmed the paper. The ink dried quickly on the chart's slightly toothy surface. He photographed the chart from above with his phone, the frame catching the table's corner and the lip of the coffee cup, so anyone looking later would know it wasn't a picture pulled off the internet. The photo was printed, punched, filed. The wind outside the porch shifted. The light stayed steady, a mellow gold. In the kitchen, the kettle murmured. Walter poured a cup and set it snug into the old ring on the tabletop, the place where the grain had darkened over years of coffee. The steam rose, thin as a stroke of ink. He laid his palm on the binder cover and pressed lightly. Beneath the black plastic were layers of paper at ease, asking no one to believe, not afraid of being forgotten. On the binder's spine, he stuck a white label that read, "Coal day/month year doc. Coordinates VHF, bruise." The handwriting was calm. He opened a drawer, took a large paper clip, and clipped on a thin envelope to hold any future receipts. Inside the envelope, he slipped a blank sheet whose header already had columns for date, time, content, witness attachments. Everything entered the counting system of an older man. Fewer words, more columns, fewer displayed feelings, more ink marks that know where to stand. On the wall, the porch light cast a soft circle onto the glass of the door. Outside on the step, the wind was stopped by quiet hinges and a closed door. Inside, a pencil ran one last line at the edge of a page, a small dash under the heading "Ch," and stopped. Walter closed the binder. The ring shut with a click, a tidy sound like someone saying enough. He slid the binder into the second drawer where important papers were kept, set it halfway in, close enough for his hand to reach. He lifted the coffee cup and drank. Warm bitterness in his mouth. In his chest, the sense that a part of the day would no longer pass unnamed. On the corner of the table, the fishing cap was almost dry, and the edge of the wool scarf someone had placed on him that morning was now folded and laid across the chair back. No monologue needed, only paper beside paper, photo beside photo, pencil line beside stamped ink, and a coffee cup set snug in the old ring, a quiet marker that truth, if tended rightly, will find its own place to stand. He set the ring binder on the table the way you'd strap on a new watch knot to show the time. But so the day's rhythm knows where to run. The phone lit up in his palm. The messages screen already open to the intended recipient. The cursor waited, a line of text half-typed, then erased. Not now, and perhaps never in this way. He backed out, scrolled through contacts, tapped the non-emergency number for the district, the little shield icon beside the community officer's name. The phone pressed to his ear, the device's warmth spreading into cheekbones, still holding cold. On the line was a steady voice asking what needed asking. He answered with the times and locations that were on paper. No more. He only requested a listen back and order session, somewhere bright enough and with a witness. The appointment was set. The call ended with a dry tick, and the screen went black again, like the plastic locker that had closed that morning. The kitchen was still. He pulled a small sheet from the drawer and wrote 4 words at the top. Listen in order. Then drew a thin line to split the page into 2 columns. On the left, markers, on the right, papers. Under markers, short lines. Departure time, recovery time coordinates, channel 16 Bruise. In the right column, he linked them, one by one. Harbor log fuel receipt, VHF record photos chart. The pencil left a faint scratch, the sort of sound an old man favors. Not blaring, not straining, only orderly. He folded the sheet and slid it into the binder's inner pocket, the edge fitting exactly, like a conductor's score lying quiet under the conductor's hand. Out on the porch, the gold light was already on. The bulb, once an anonymous replacement, had become the evening's anchor. He opened the door hinges smooth, the step no longer complaining. The wind carried salt and the smell of dry pine. Walter set 2 wooden chairs near the porch edge, spaced far enough for respect, but not so far that voices would have to work. He wiped the fine rain from the seats and turned them so that when someone looked up, they would see a sky not cut in half by power lines. On the small porch table, he set an old wooden tray with 2 hollows, worn by years of cups. The first cup for himself, already accustomed to the old ring impressed on the kitchen table. The second he poured with his left hand, slower, and set into the right hand hollow. The coffee sent up thin steam, the scent of roasted beans mixed with wood oil warming the air. He draped a light coat over the back of the chair meant for the listener, a gesture for respect, not for weather. Where the chair legs met the floor, he wedged in a small wooden shim so the chair wouldn't wobble. What would be said tomorrow needed a level plane to stand on. He brought the binder out and set it on the table between the 2 steaming cups. The colored tabs peeking from the paper edges looked like miniature channel markers. B, K, V. He opened the rings and ran his finger through the order, left to right, top to bottom, a route for the truth to go straight, not down side alleys. He turned to the Bruise photo, checked that the corner bore the printed time, flipped to the chart and dotted the circle round the position once more, so the ink was just dark enough. Turned to the Channel 16 record and looked at the fresh red copy stamp. His right hand rested on the page edge, the middle finger tapping twice in old habit to confirm everything was in place. The phone buzzed once, briefly, confirming the appointment, date, time, location. He didn't open it to read carefully, he just long pressed to save it to his own calendar, then laid the phone face down beside the binder. At his feet, the doormat still held a few grains of sand from past returns. He stooped to pick up a fleck and dropped it into the planter, returning what belongs to the earth, so the porch would be clean when unfamiliar feet stopped there. Inside, the wall clock passed a quarter. Night hadn't fully settled, but the birds were thinning out. Walter sat in his own chair, tried the lean, tried where his feet rested, then stood and pulled the chair a little so the porch light wouldn't shine straight into the other person's eyes. He tested lifting the second cup. The heat was just enough to warm the palm when raised, not scald. He set it down and turned the handle to the right, a small detail for a right-handed person he'd never met for more than a phone call. Practiced kindness doesn't ask whether someone deserves it. It simply adjusts things to be proper. Beside the table, he propped a small enamel dish and stood 2 stirring spoons on its rim. The tap of metal sounded like a period. Inside the house, he dimmed the other lights, letting the porch gold take charge. On the back of the empty chair, the light coat hung like a gentle shadow. In front, the binder lay still, the rings closed, the light throwing a thin line across the metal edge. He stepped back into the kitchen for a moment and wrote a pencil line on the inside of the cabinet door where he keeps reminders. Date, time, porch. 3 short words, enough to cue what matters. Passing the phone on the counter, his finger slid over the messages icon without thinking. The screen lit with the last unsent exchange. He shut it at once, not letting the blue glow touch his intention. Somewhere in him, a hot fleck wanted to flare, like a radio cut off mid-sentence, but he let it deaden under the layers of paper and arrangement. Anger, if any, was invited to sit in the chair no one would sit in and drink the cup no one would drink. The sky dropped one shade darker. The porch light held steady. The wind no longer caught on the step. The small objects around him had all found their places: cups, chairs, tray coat binder, phone. He closed the screen door. The old squeal was gone. Everything waited there. The warm hold of the second cup, a clean, level tabletop, and a stack of papers that knew how to speak in their own order. Walter sat down and kept quiet. There was no intention to deliver a speech, only to open the binder to the right page when the hour came, and let the papers speak instead of anger. In stories like this, straightness of heart doesn't need to raise its voice. It only needs a chair to sit in and a light to stand still. That afternoon, the dock held a quiet not of a holiday, but of work set into its proper hours. Water lapped around the pilings, the damp wood surface a deep brown. The smell of diesel from a distant crane mixed with dry weed and anti-fouling paint. On the steel table under the harbor office awning sat an old wiping rag, a box of tissues, and a ballpoint pen tied on a cord. The low-hung yellow bulb let its light fall like a chalk stroke on the cold surface. Harriet stood angled behind it, one hand resting lightly at the edge of her apron waistband, the glasses on their brown cord brushing her neck. Beside her, the skipper of the Ivy May, broad-shouldered, oilskin-worn Pum with Salt, stood straight-backed, hands laced behind his neck, his face turned slightly toward the water. They didn't speak. Their presence was like two mooring posts, keeping the deck from sliding off the truth. The district officer arrived on time, dark blue coat, a small notebook peeking from the breast pocket. He set a little recorder on the corner of the table. Its red light blinked once and held steady. His voice in introduction was only just loud enough, like a small knife slicing through snarled lines. Walter nodded, pulled out a chair but didn't sit. He set the ring binder on the table, the spine turned toward himself. A white label at the edge read, "Coal Day, Month, Year, Doc, Coordinates, VHF, Bruise." He laid his hand lightly on the cover, like an old craftsman checking a surface for true before he sets a plane. The rings opened. A small click sounded, then nothing. Walter turned the first page to show the small chart with the dark ink circle around the recovery coordinates. In the corner was a reprint of the map as photographed on his kitchen table. The rim of a coffee cup in the frame, a way of saying this paper had lived in a kitchen and not just in a machine. He slid the chart toward the officer and let his finger come to rest at the center of the circle. Beneath it waited Harriet's copy of the harbor log. The morning rental's departure time had been darkened, the notes box left blank, like a breathing space reserved for this. Next came the fuel receipt, the thermal strip already flattened, pump time, liters, boat ID lined up like channel markers. Walter set it to the right of the chart, lower edges flush with the table. After the receipt came the Channel 16 log. The line, "Person recovered Ivy May," with the time, ended by a short black pencil dot. He didn't touch the writing. He only held the corner so the light wouldn't glare. Testimony wasn't written by oath, but by presence. Harriet shifted one step. The skipper gave the slightest nod when the officer glanced a question. They didn't retell. They confirmed the marks on paper with the nods of people used to speaking in signs. The officer wrote a few words in his notebook, left hand steadying the pen so it wouldn't skate over the cold steel. Walter opened to the photo page. The left wrist with a bruise the color of ripe plum. In the corner, the printed time, 5:42, with the shadow of his kitchen wall clock behind it, the minute hand like a silver splinter. He didn't hold it up. He set it flat and turned it so anyone looking could see the time. Below it, a black and white print of the text, "Go farther out for space." The short line lay in a wide expanse of white, cold and clean as a scalpel. The air around the steel table thickened. The sound of water working along the foot of the dock shifted into a steady undertone. Everything was laid out in order: position, receipt, witness, photo, Channel 16. No preamble, no accusation, only small pieces, each carrying its own weight. Footsteps sounded from the gangway, waterproof boots on planks tapping like a pen on a tabletop. Cole appeared in the open doorway, a sharp young cologne cutting into the salt, an off-key note. He stopped a short distance from the table, his eyes sweeping the steel surface where the papers lay flat. He adjusted his cuff, the movement neat and closed like in the morning. His mouth gave the old line no run-up, no thought. No one will believe you. His voice was thin, falling among the papers like a small drop of water, not enough to wash away a line of ink already dry. Nobody answered. The officer lifted his pen and recorded those 6 words, the time and a slanted note, repeated. Harriet kept her distance. The skipper tipped his head 1 degree, as if to keep the wind from hitting him full in the face. Walter reached for the binder and turned the pages over once more, slower this time, letting the light pass across the numbers the way it passes over offshore signboards. Each marker need only be seen right once. The silence in that moment wasn't empty. It was full of the sound of ink drying, the faint warmth of the morning's wool scarf still in the collar of his coat, the recorder's red light blinking evenly, the smell of oil and iron. It was full of the breath of 4 people standing in an arc around a steel table, 1 to open the binder, 2 to witness, 1 to hold the pen. Cole edged half a step, his hand resting on the empty chair as if to test whether it would take his weight. The officer raised 2 fingers, light not to block, but to invite him to remain where the light was good. Walter turned the chart toward Cole, not as an explanation, but as a reminder that the sea has its coordinates, and you cannot say otherwise about a number that has come to a stop. Wind came off the water and lifted the paper edges for a beat, then let them lie flat again. Above, a gull changed course, its shadow sliding over the tabletop like a glove. In the harbor office, the wall clock moved 1 mark. On the small speaker, the weather channel ticked a single beep. The officer set his pen to the first line of the form and wrote the first letter. Walter closed his fingers over the binder's edge, the knuckles rising slightly. He didn't look at Cole. He looked at the small marker tabs peeking from the paper B, K, V letters that don't know how to lie. In the end, a confrontation doesn't need raised voices. It needs a flat table, a steady light, a few numbers with a home, and people patient enough to let the order of documents go before emotion. When the officer lifted his head, his eyes passed over each face the way you check a boat before it leaves the dock. No one added anything. By now, the story had its own voice, the voice of position, receipts, witnesses, photos, and Channel 16 loud enough that the cologne laced with salt could no longer drown it out. Harriet set the copy of the harbor log down on the steel table, the paper's edge meeting the dew-cold ridge exactly. The fresh red copy stamp sat in the right corner beside the departure time in bold. She pressed it lightly flat with a fingertip, then drew her hand back, letting the ink do the work of ink. On the steel surface, each sheet was like a channel marker set off from shore, standing upright without need of explanation. The officer tilted the binder toward the light, his finger following the order Walter had laid out. Chart with circled coordinates. Morning fuel receipt, Channel 16 log bruise photo with printed time printed text message. He turned the chart, holding the edge so it wouldn't catch the wind. The pen tip touched the ink ring very lightly. A chipped plastic ruler was drawn out to line things up, straight as a fairway. At the table's corner, the little recorder blinked a red dot and then held steady, capturing only the even breathing of those present. The skipper of the Ivy May nodded when the officer's eyes asked for a mark of confirmation. Harriet stood still, one hand resting lightly on the back of the empty chair, her nails dusted with dried salt. Walter didn't intrude. He only held one corner of the binder so the papers wouldn't slide, his middle finger tapping twice, very softly, the habit of someone used to letting objects stand in their proper places before speaking of people. Cole came closer, his cologne thinned with salt in the wind. He stood at the edge of the light, pulled his cuff straight, let his eyes skim the lines of ink and stop at the wrist photo. A plum-colored patch laid flat, the corner of the image showing a silver-minute hand. His lips moved. The old line slipped out as reflex. No one will believe you. 6 words fell onto the steel, raising no ripple, like a small stone dropped into water that had long since quietly set. The officer didn't look up. He read the report, an even voice, each marker called by time and coordinates, then set his pen to paper. The nib scraped very lightly, leaving a fine burr of sound. He turned the page and signed a short stroke name, pared down to practical angles. Beside him, a small camera came up to chest height and clicked once silently. The flash glanced off the corner of Harriet's lenses, then went out like a highlighter stroked across to mark his scene. A nod, a hand extended. Cole offered his wrist by the instinct of someone who has watched this before. The metal came near and closed together, small as a spoon touching the side of a cup. There was no shout, no raised voice, only the tight sound of two halves of a thing made to meet. Harriet set a tiny delivery slip on the paper's edge and pressed the date stamp, one straight push. Down and up. The skipper signed in the witness box, the signature slanting like a mooring line meeting wind. The officer flipped his notebook. His pen tapped the steel edge twice, a wordless signal that this section had run its course. Walter gathered the sheets in order, smoothed each edge to a line, and returned them to the binder. The rings closed with a neat, round click. Cole turned his face toward the dock's dark, his breath making a short white streak and fading. He neither protested nor confessed. His stance was still as a buoy, refusing to bob. The officer touched his elbow lightly, inviting him to step back half a pace so the camera could take another angle of the table with the numbered documents. Another small flash, like someone flicking a thumbnail in the air to test whether paint is dry. Walter didn't look at the wrist and cuffs. He looked at the ring binder in his own hands, thicker by a finger's breadth than in the morning, and at its shadow sitting neatly in the pool of gold light. In the corner, he tugged a tissue from the box set out on the table to blot a drop of water that had fallen from the chart's edge, then balled it up and laid it neatly beside the pen on its cord. His back was straight, not for victory or defeat, but because the objects were standing where they should. Outside, waves beat evenly along the dock, neither hard nor weak, like the heartbeat of a town long used to salt. From the small speaker in the office, the weather channel ticked once. The voice went by like a draft of wind, steady, northeast. On the tabletop, the last signature was put down. The pen went back in the cup. The camera lowered. The report was folded and clipped with a black binder clip at the top. No one raised their voice. Everything proceeded under the force of paper, ink, and calm gestures. The officer closed his notebook and dipped his head a degree. Harriet slid the chair in to meet the table. The skipper lifted his chin toward the water as if greeting a familiar wave. Walter tucked the binder inside his coat with the light motion of shelving a cup dried and clean. At the end of the dock, a gull changed course, its shadow sliding across the steel and away. The dock returned to its everyday tempo, cold and trim, and within that tempo, a day had been nailed down by evidence, leaving only the sound of a pen signing, a soft camera flash, and the waves, enough for anyone to understand what had just come to rest. Night fell. The gold light on the porch stood still like a short hand, not blinking. The wind passed over the step without dragging along the old groan. The hinge only breathed softly as the door closed. In the kitchen, warm water ran in a thin thread. Walter washed the cup with practiced motions, turned once, rubbed the rim, set it on its side to drain, then put it back exactly into the dark ring in the center of the tabletop. That snugness made a very small sound, a touch of ceramic on wood, just enough to let him know the day had closed in its proper place. The ring binder lay on the table for a moment, the edge of its white label catching the light in a faint streak. He set his palm on it, feeling the flat papers beneath the cover, the click of the rings still warm in his memory of the afternoon. He pulled open the second drawer, the drawer for things that needn't be displayed, and slid the binder in between two old folders. The spine met the wood side and stopped at a familiar spot. Beside it, a thin envelope marked follow-up already held a few blank sheets. He pulled out the used slips and clipped them behind. The envelope thinned by a finger's breadth, light as someone just relieved of a load on the shoulder. He wrote a short pencil line in the small notebook hanging by the kitchen cabinet. The date, the time, the 2 words submitted. The strokes were straight, without pressure. Then he turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the porch light shining into the window pane. On the hooks, the coat had dried of salt. The fishing cap rested on the rusty nail, its brim curved in the old habit. He touched it once, as if brushing off the trace of water still lingering in his head. The small things of the house had returned to place. Broom standing straight, dishcloth folded in two, coffee thermos lid turned with its handle toward the right hand. No voices, but the kitchen gave off a kind of consent among objects. He walked down the dark hall and stopped at the front door. The porch light still held. The thin gold streak printed on the step was like a line stretched across the way, neither scaring nor inviting. Beside the door, the two porch chairs were still there from the afternoon, their wood surfaces dried of the dew. The chair kept for the listener still bore the faint warm dent of the cup just washed. Walter moved the chair in close to the wall to spare it the late mist and laid a light coat over its back. His carefulness was like setting back a letter that had been typed half a millimeter off. In the bedroom, he drew the curtain to a narrow slit. The wind carried the scent of pine needles through. He didn't turn on the radio. Silence had its structure. Far off, the sound of waves. Nearer, the wall clock's steady ticks. Between them, his own breath. He lay on his side, his back slowly taking the mattress's weight, his hand on the place in his chest that often tightens. No tumbling dreams came. Only a long slice of night, smooth as the water's surface when the wind shifts. Sunday morning, the first mist light beaded on the kitchen window frame, cold enough to pry a hand from a cup. He made a fresh pot of coffee, poured the first part into his own cup, then decanted the rest into the thermos. The calendar taped to the fridge turned to a new week. Sunday's box still blank. Walter took a pen and wrote 3 words, Community Center, then added a small note, Register for Sea Survival class. The road to town was empty. The breakfast place wasn't crowded yet, the smell of grease mixing with the clink of spoons on porcelain. The community center opened early. The wooden board by the porch held a new poster, Coastal Safety Training, Volunteers Welcome. In the hall, a folding table held a sign-up sheet. A stack of life jackets of all sizes stood in columns. Ring buoys hung on the wall like old moons. Walter took a pen and wrote his name on a blank line. Beside the skills box, he wrote briefly, Sea Survival, Breathing, Floating, Conserving Energy, SOS Signals. His letters leaned a little, but were as clear as channel markers. The attendant, a middle-aged woman with her hair clipped up, slid a thin packet toward him. He nodded, not saying much. The plastic smell of new life jackets made him think of damp rope at the dock. The chill of last night's water slid along his spine and then eased when his hand touched the paper cover. In the practice room beyond, a few young people were trying on float vests, the hand pumps wheezing. On the wall, a whiteboard sketched a rip current, arrows pulling from shore out to open water, written in marker, Don't swim against drift sideways, go out to the edge. He stood watching for a while, his head dipping slightly as if recognizing an old route. On the way home, he swung by the dock. The water was brighter, a few gulls already gathered atop the wooden posts. The harbor office door was ajar. Harriet was sweeping, the broom rasping the floor. He didn't go in, only raised his hand lightly in a distant greeting. She lifted her head to nod, then went back to sweeping. People who have done their part don't need extra words. At noon, the house still smelled of coffee. He opened the drawer to check the binder without taking it out. He only touched the spine, as if calling roll. The follow-up envelope lay neatly beside it, thin as a page with no more story left to tell. He closed the drawer and looked out the window. The gold light on the porch still didn't tremble. On the table, the morning's cup had dried a bendy brown ring around its lip. He washed it clean and set it snug into the old circle again. In the afternoon, he wrote a few more lines for next Sunday's class. Breathing tips at sea. Don't fight the ocean's waves. Borrow their force. Choose a cloud to count by. The pencil slid smoothly. What he prepared wasn't to talk about fear, but to show someone the path through it. Out on the porch, the 2 chairs were pulled back into the sun. No one sat and no one needed to. Peace doesn't call anyone by name, it only asks each person to return to his own part. When sunset tilted across the eaves, Walter carried the coffee thermos to the steps and stood looking at the empty street. He took a sip, letting the bitterness travel from tongue to chest like a small congratulations. No one called, no one told it back, no surprises arrived. There was only the steady porch light, the step no longer complaining, a ring binder put away in a drawer, and his name lying quiet on the volunteer list at the community center. That was enough for a day to remain with its own portion. The fishing cap hung on the chair's armrest, the brim in its familiar curve, a tiny, loose thread drying in the late afternoon sun. On the fabric, a fine white salt line remained, like a chalk mark, the trace of water that had passed and left something behind. Wind from the porch blew through the empty space of the house, lifting the edge of the curtain for a beat and letting it fall. In the kitchen, the smell of cooled coffee mixed with warm wood. In front of the refrigerator, he took off the fish-shaped magnet with paint worn at the tail and stuck up a small sheet, squared paper torn from an old notebook. The pencil line ran straight, neither thickened nor thinned. From now on, let the evidence speak. The rest, time. He smoothed a finger along the edge so the wind wouldn't tug it. The paper lay still amid a world of objects consenting to return to their places. A spoon set upside down in a cup, the coffee thermos with its handle turned toward the right hand, the dishcloth folded in two on the back of the chair. In the second drawer, the ring binder had gone to sleep no thicker, no thinner, the even breathing of a day that had finished its part. He made a small circuit of the house, not to look, but to return. The oil bottle went back on the third shelf. The first aid kit near the door got a new roll of bandage, the leftover rope from yesterday he trimmed, coiled into a nest and pushed under the sink. On the table, the chart was folded in half, the crease pressed down so it wouldn't spring up. Each task ended with a very small snug, the sound of objects understanding one another. Evening darkened. He opened the porch door. The steps stopped complaining. The yellow light came on and held steady, no flicker like the previous nights. Two chairs were pulled out and set parallel. He sat in his own chair, back straight, hands around the cup. The chair on the left was left empty, its wood still blotched by a pale ring from yesterday's cup that circle-dried very slowly in the wind. He did not pour another. There was no need for two cups just now. From the street, a car's sound stretched into a long line and then cut. Here and there, people walked dogs past, their shadows slicing the strip of light on the steps without stopping. Overhead, a gull shifted perches between two pilings, the brush of its wings light in the cold air. He set the cup down, handle turned outward, true to the old habit. The salt smell faded from his collar. The skin on his hand stopped stinging where the bruise was, leaving only a plum color softening like fruit left overnight on the windowsill. Inside, the refrigerator gave a short hum. The magnet holding the paper did not tremble. Beneath the line of writing, he added a strip of clear tape at the edge, a small precaution against damp days. No one would read it for him. No one argued with those words. They simply stayed there, like a tack reminding him of the straight line to keep. By the time the dew rose, the fishing cap was completely dry. He took it down, patted it so the salt fell as dust, and hung it on the rusty nail in the kitchen wall, the nail that had been waiting for exactly this weight. Somewhere inside him, something heavier fell away too, without a sound. He closed the window, leaving a slit just wide enough for the night smell to come in. The porch light held. Late at night, he went out to the porch again. The empty chair had taken a film of dew. He wiped it with the hem of his coat, set a thin cushion for the back, then withdrew his hand. Not an invitation, only making space, a place reserved for any day, if the heart manages to return. On the small table, he left the hollow, worn by the second cup, empty. The silence settled to the proper fit, not so full it choked, not so hollow it pulled everything away. In the drawer, the follow-up envelope lay, flat, not taut. At the community center, his name was already on the list. Next Sunday, he would talk about how to loosen the back and choose a cloud to count by. And on his own porch, he only needed to sit still, hear the light cling to the wall, the night settle on the tree, and the chair beside him that no one pulled. Forgiveness, if it comes, will arrive by way of small things that know where to stand, not by a speech. When he went inside, his hand closed the door very gently, the light still gold, the chair still empty. The note on the fridge lay still like a marker. There was no conclusion read aloud, only room wide enough for a step on another day. And in that open space, he lived his part, keeping an empty chair on the porch, enough room for some day if the heart manages to return. In the end, no one beat anyone by speaking loud. There were only small things returning to their places, the porch light holding steady through the night, the coffee cup set snug into the old ring, the binder lying still behind the drawer's wooden face. Revenge here, if it needs a name, was only the way a grown man set a boundary down, lightly but sure. Money to the place of money, truth to the place of truth, silence to the proper share of silence. The rest he handed over to time and to weekly acts of decency, teaching others to breathe, float, and survive when the water is cold. If you've ever chosen to let evidence speak in place of anger, tell one small detail of your own. It doesn't need to be long. A receipt clipped in, an unsent message, a porch light you replaced. In your story, what is the exhibit? And if you had to put back in its place the very first thing right now, what would you choose? I will read each line slowly, the way the gold light was made to shine on a quiet way home.